Greetings, friends. Chris Vaneman here, Dean of the School of the Arts at Converse University, and I'm joined again by my friend John Concklin, Music Director of the Spartanburg Philharmonic. We're going to be telling you all about the upcoming concert, Saturday, February 17th at 7 p.m. in Twitchell Auditorium. John, so great to see you again.
Great to be here. Thanks for, well, I shouldn't say thanks for having me. I see you all the time, so it's good to see you again.
But nevertheless, it's always great to see you. So got another really interesting concert coming out for us. And I think that I have located a pattern in your programming here, which is to say that as I'm looking at this year's programming, what I'm seeing is one relatively familiar piece by a well-known composer paired with a couple of things that are probably almost assuredly less familiar to the regular concert goers because they're less familiar to me. Am I correct in my deductions there? Is this the plan?
Yes. I mean, I think on the whole, there's some other factors that go into it. I mean, I definitely like pairing sort of new things with established things. But they're pieces that are immediately likable on first listen is also the other sort of important thing. So I like throwing the curveball a little bit, but it's one that I think everyone can hit to continue that metaphor.
Yeah. So let's set aside that Beethoven symphony, and we'll talk about that last. But let's sort of maybe approach this concert in program order.
Sure.
Which means that we're starting off with Augusta Holmès, or Holmès, depending on when you ask, right?
That's right.
Yeah, she's a really interesting character. Tell us a little bit about her.
Sure. So I found her on the radio of all things. There was an Andromeda, a piece titled Andromeda that I heard that was immediately something that I thought that I should know, and I was trying to place it in time and then realized it was this composer that I had only heard of in name, but had never actually encountered any of her music. And I began looking into it and realized that the reason is that everything she wrote is massive. And so it is really difficult to get her stuff on stage. But then also somehow her biographical stuff is a little limited in terms of what we've been able to piece together for it. The stuff we do know, though, is that she's just sort of wildly interesting. So she was writing sort of towards the late 19th century, heavily influenced by Wagner and sort of just the total art movement, if you will. So by total art, what we're talking about here is that you've got the single artist who's controlling all the elements on stage. Yeah, musical, visual, any text, all of the set design, everything. And she sort of conceived everything. And so I've always wanted to get something of hers on stage, but because of the size of these things, there's sort of prohibitions on it. But with this concert coming up right close to February 14th, Valentine's Day, she has this little interlude that is just gorgeous, and it's called Night and Love. And it speaks to the sort of theme or the timing of the concert, and it's just sort of a luscious Wagnerian 7 or 8 minutes of a love song, basically, and it's just gorgeous. And so I was really happy to be able to get this thing on stage. It's again one of these pieces that's immediately likable on first listen, and then her backstory is just so fascinating. I mean, she was kind of a siren for all of the French male composers in Paris. They were all in love with her. Saint-Saëns said that she was an extremist, but in the next sentence, he admitted to proposing to her at least 2 or 3 times. And so she was wildly popular at the time, in spite of the push against women to not do things such as compose music, as wild as that sounds. Has this sort of litany of really huge, gorgeous operatic pieces that we were trying to get on stage. At least I'm trying to get on stage at some point.
And so talk about her name for a little bit. You know, it was something that I alluded to. Is she Augusta Holmès? Is she Augusta Holmès with the sort of French accent grave there on the last syllable? What's the story?
Yeah, so she's half Irish and half French. Born to an Irish mother, I think, French father, and lived in France. And truly it was Augusta Holmès. And the story goes that she changed her name and added the accent to make it Holmès. But I just imagined that the French were like, we refuse to pronounce Holmes, change it. And so it was a very easy change. And so Holmès, I guess we should go with, which is the last thing that she used. And she married a French poet, which is also like the most French thing to do. Cohabitated, I think, in Paris. And
lived outside of marriage for quite a while as well.
Lived a grand old life, writing music. As you mentioned before, being independently wealthy helped sort of open those doors. And just live a really interesting, fascinating life.
Yeah, and was a big crusader for Irish independence, right?
Because
the Ireland at that point was part of the British Empire, and so all of the Irish who were fighting against that had essentially exiled themselves to Paris.
Yes,
where I gather they were basically hanging out in her living room.
I think it was, there's a lot of mutual dislike of the English across the Channel. So
True, right.
I think that was in safe company there. And yes, salons were big, and so that was sort of part of the course of the night. You talked a little bit about the Irish independence politics, a little bit about the French politics, played some music, drink some wine, and then go wherever the night takes you from there.
It sounds like that would be an ideal subject for a movie, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. No, it's fantastic. Someone just needs to write it up. Peter, you should write it up.
If there are movie producers out there, give me a call.
Yeah.
You can access me via the Spartanburg Philharmonic office.
That's right.
I will share the profits with you. So we've got that, which is, having listened to it in order to write the notes for it, it's a beautiful, beautiful piece. It's easily accessible. It's one where the tune is front and center always. And so that's why it sounds like a love song to us, I'm sure. So we're beginning the concert with that. And then we're moving on to something coming from South America, correct? From Argentina?
That's
Tell us
right.
about that.
So we're going to fly across the Atlantic there. Not a lot of music from South America that makes its way into the concert hall, but this composer is one that Argentina does have sort of a history of composition, and Alberto Ginastera is a composer that I have known since graduate school. He wrote tango music, of course, but then this piece, concert variations, is a piece that I just adore. It's also sort of a tip of the cap to my colleagues in the Spartanburg Philharmonic, who I sat next to for so long. The piece has a pretty sizable solo for every single principal player, and so every principal player, that includes the bass and the viola. I know that might be hard to believe for people, but the viola has a massive solo. There's a pretty big flute solo that pretty much opens the piece.
Well, it starts with a huge cello solo.
That's right.
Is that you've got that really impassioned cello solo, and then it goes from there into this frenetic flute stuff.
But it's he based it off the music of Argentinian cowboys, the gauchos, and so it's the primary instrument there was guitar, and so the first notes that you hear are someone strumming the open strings of the guitar. So you have E, A, D, G, B, E on the harp, and then the melody.
Nice job. You got those all in order, folks. Point that out.
And then the cellist takes it over from there. And so it's all centered around sort of song and guitar music. And it ends with this really fun finale that kind of sounds, someone told me that it kind of sounds like Stravinsky and Copland, but in South America. I think our principal trombonist said that to me, which is right. He's right. It does. It's just a really fun, kinetic, fast-moving, energetic piece that features everyone. So it was important to me to sort of highlight the people that are on stage, give them sort of front and center presence for at least a couple minutes, especially in my first season. And so it pairs well with the Beethoven and the Holmès. And so it's just a really fun piece that I always sort of come back to.
And Ginastera, as sometimes he's called, he's another one of these with two pronunciations depending on who you ask and when you ask, He was somebody who, like Augusta Holmès, was somebody who was very politically active, right? Like he was sort of in there in the mix as the Perón, what would you call it, administration, or the Perón government kind of came and went and then came back again. And he was part of the struggle and somebody who was fighting for democracy, as I understand things.
Yeah, I think we sort of take Argentina for granted that it's only in the past couple decades that it sort of stabilized into a democracy. It really was tough going, and he, as you mentioned, was at times very bravely outspoken personally and then also in his music. There was almost a sort of a return to the roots of Argentinianism that I think he was seeking, and sort of casting aside what was current then as sort of not the real Argentina kind of thing. But yeah, another sort of fascinating person to read about, and how their art and life sort of intermixed, and when I think he also had to exile himself.
Right.
Yeah.
So this indeed is a really exciting piece. It's a piece that I had heard a few times. I've never played it, never had the chance to play it. It looks like a lot of fun to play, and it sounds like a lot of fun to play. But it's certainly an exciting piece to listen to. And it's a very interesting piece to study the score of. And one of the things that struck me as I was listening to it is that each individual variation is super virtuosic, is asking something often really demanding and difficult of the solo players. But it would be a unique challenge for you as a conductor to kind of string together these long variations and make them, instead of having the potential to sort of flop the way a long theme and variations can, to maintain their tension and maintain their energy and continue to get more exciting as you approach the end. So let me actually ask you, as a conductor, what are the things that you're thinking about as you work your way through a relatively long theme and variations like that?
So he actually does us a favor in the sense that because every single one is a solo, it's like you have a 3-minute concerto except a series of them. So in a concerto, there's always that tension between who's leading whom, and it's always sort of one or the other, right? Or sometimes when it comes together, which is really nice, is when the tension releases. And so in that sense, he's already built in sort of the tension of it, which it's sort of like a dance. So I'll dance with the concertmaster, and I'll dance with Alboy, the principal violist, and whoever's the soloist. There will be me, and then the soloist, and sort of the orchestra. And there's sort of a natural tension there. In a straight theme and variations, in which there's no soloist or no built-in tension, usually you kind of have to go with how the composer structured it. So the best composers will sort of show you where they're leading to or coming away from. And then the statement of the theme is always then very important, because you have to present it in a way in which then people can hear the variations. And so anytime we do a theme and variations, like Eroica, for example, Beethoven's Third Symphony, the last movement is a theme and variations. The statement of the theme has to be in a very clear way that you can hear it sort of evolve over time, because then the best composers will also bring back the theme in a full statement at the end, in which they sort of book in the thing.
Right.
And so usually in the middle, there's some sort of climax or release of tension that you sort of have to build to. And it kind of depends. So, you can do it rhythmically, you can do it through the harmonies. They'll take you sort of through different key areas. And finding those things in the score, and then, you sort of, that's part of the rehearsal process, is sort of getting the entire arch together. Otherwise, you sort of risk it sort of sounding episodic.
Yeah.
And you can lose people's interest. So like Enigma Variations is a big one. And unless you sort of really structure it the right way, it could be easy to sort of lose people, and where are we, which movement are we in, or emotionally sort of lose track of where you're supposed to be, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I was thinking that there are moments within a large theme and variations like this piece where the orchestra has come to a little bit of a rest, a little bit of a pause at the end of each of the variations, and where we as listeners can have that opportunity to have a little bit of a rest or a pause. But it was occurring to me that you as a conductor, at that moment, you really can't take a rest or a pause, because it's up to you to determine how long of a rest or pause is the right length. If you allow things to sag too much in between all of those variations, and everybody gets to stop and have a cigarette and a sandwich or something like that, then the whole thing can get really kind of dull and saggy on us. So that I bet as you're approaching the end of each of these variations, are you having to think really hard about, now how much time do we take? What's the appropriate amount of time for the whole piece? Does the orchestra need a little bit more time at this moment? Does the soloist need a little bit more time? What goes through your mind in those moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think you try to walk in with sort of a general idea of where you can take time or where you need to move through it. I do have a plan there, because he's also prescriptive with certain ones that he wants you to go straight through, or he'll put a fermato over it, which means he kind of wants you to wait, or and so in some ways he kind of dictates what he'd like to hear. The part that becomes art is in the moment of the performance, things happen and someone needs an extra breath, or you sense that the energy's still there, you want to keep it moving, and so you sort of might go through. And so in the process of rehearsing with the orchestra, you sort of give everyone fair warning that this is what we plan to do, but there's also sort of a plus or minus on either side, depending on the moment. And I think that most orchestra members can sort of feel that, and there's the 80% that you sort of plan for, and then the final 20% on the concert day, you sort of intuit, and sort of that's the live creation part of it that makes it the most exciting. But yeah, there's also ones that, before the trumpet trombone one, which is sort of towards the end, you kind of really want to give that one a beat, because the music transitions, so it sort of takes a really hard turn, and you can either go straight into it, or you really need to give it a beat, and then just so the ears can prepare. So it sort of depends on if you think the audience would appreciate sort of the disruption of what's been happening, or if they like to hear sort of a period on the end of the previous sentence, new paragraph, and then go into the new thing. Yeah, so those are the types of decisions that happen in silence when I'm sort of looking at the score, preparing for the rehearsals and the concert.
And this is the kind of thing that as a listener I find really interesting, because when I'm sitting out there and I'm enjoying a concert, there are a lot of things where I'm fully aware consciously of what the conductor is doing at that moment to shape my experience. But there are also a lot of things that you've decided going into things that you're deciding right there on the evening of, on the fly, that are also shaping my experience in ways that I'm not fully conscious of.
Yeah.
And this kind of guiding through the structure of a piece is one of those that as a listener, I'm usually not aware of the fact that you're doing it, but this is really one of the crucial jobs of the conductor, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you're sort of, you're host of the show, and it's not just for the orchestra, it's for the people in the audience too. And like you said, the decisions that you make have an effect on people's experience with the piece. And so if you take a long time, that really should be intentional, or if you take time or if you don't take time, those things should be in calculus with the experience of everybody in the room. And yeah, that's a nice part. That's the nice part of the job of sort of thinking globally around those, because at that point, you've taken a look at the notes and harmonies, and sort of you're being able to zoom out at that point and really sort of think about the piece as an experience. And that was a lesson that I learned over time, because you're not trained for necessarily that in school or even in apprenticeships. They just sort of want to get you up there conducting, and that's hard enough. Just get the orchestra through things. But especially now as music director, it's not only that piece's experience, but then it's the concert experience, and then it's the season experience, and sort of the multiple seasons experience of making sure that it's, again, not episodic. It's truly a through line with a narrative that connects things. I think that's how audiences are built and people form relationships with orchestras, is sort of feel like there's a story happening.
Yeah. So that we as listeners can feel like when we reach the end of a season, that it's a little bit different than it was at the beginning. And as the years go by, we can build up a relationship and a history, and you can kind of work with that.
That's right.
As a conductor too.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the last half of this concert. And I said a few minutes ago that I've noticed the pattern of picking one familiar piece and a couple of less familiar pieces. But then I actually had to stop and ask myself, well, wait a minute, how familiar is Beethoven's Fourth Symphony really? And I'm betting that a lot of concert goers kind of had the same sort of experience that I did, which when I saw the program, I was like, oh, sure, Beethoven's Fourth, I know that. And then I had to ask myself, wait a minute, do I actually know Beethoven's Fourth Symphony? It's one of those pieces that tends to be a little bit underappreciated, isn't it? You know, we pay so much attention to the Third Symphony and the Fifth Symphony, the ones that came on either side, that the Fourth has a little bit of a tendency to get overlooked, doesn't it?
It does. So, you know, I think the general understanding is that the odd number symphonies are the ones that get played the most, and then the even ones after, but with 6 sort of being the major one out of those. We went back and looked, and we think that it's been at least 2 decades since Beethoven 4 has been on the stage. So in the past 20 years, we've had all 9 symphonies except for the 4th, and so it was sort of a way of bringing something that was familiar, but also maybe bringing something that people had not encountered in Spartanburg, at least in recent history. It's probably, I favor the even-numbered symphonies. I appreciate the odd-number symphonies. But the more and more I learn about Beethoven, the more complex as a human being he becomes to me. And I empathize with the way that he composes, especially the odd-number symphonies. There is a struggle, because I will say that he's not necessarily the most gifted composer. He's a fantastic musician, and he writes pieces that are transcendental, but he's not necessarily the most gifted composer like a Mendelssohn or a Mozart or a Bach. They would encounter problems and immediately solve them. He has to sort of will the thing into existence, the solution or sort of the climax or whatever the case may be, getting through to the next thing, which is why I do think a lot of people identify with it, because most of us are not geniuses, right? We sort of have to struggle, yeah.
So this is something where it didn't always come easily or naturally to Beethoven, and sometimes you have the sense of this in the piece, right?
Yes, and so sort of because of that, and then reverse engineering back to his childhood, his father was pretty abusive because he was not a genius. He was not Mozart. He was talented, but he wasn't able to just do the things naturally that Mozart was able to do. He was able to learn them over time.
Yeah. So to interrupt and fill in a little bit of a blank for audience members who might not know this story, Beethoven's father had very much observed the phenomenon, the social and frankly economic phenomenon that child Mozart was. That Mozart's father had traipsed him all over Europe and shown him off and made considerable amounts of money off of his child genius son, little Amadeus Mozart. And Beethoven's father, who was a struggling musician himself, hoped to have the same sort of deal, the same sort of arrangement, the same sort of sweet business thing that Leopold Mozart had with little Amadeus. But it didn't quite work out with Beethoven. Beethoven wasn't quite the genius. He wasn't quite as cute as little Mozart. And so Beethoven really struggled with that as a child. And his dad was indeed very abusive to him.
Yeah, from what we understand is that he did find success, just not to the level that his father expected. And so you begin to see this in the compositions of, he will encounter a problem, and then instead of solving it, he'll make it worse, and then he'll solve it. Which, psychologically, from what I understand of childhood trauma, that might be a thing that people do. I have to, in order to feel success, I have to make this hard on myself, and then I can, and then I come to the solution, and it feels normal, right?
So tell us for a moment, if you will, how does a composer do that? Like what's the sign when you're looking at a score that a composer has encountered this problem and is somehow making it worse before he solves it?
Yeah, so the especially in Beethoven's time, the goal is to start in one key, you go to another key, usually the dominant key. So if you start in C, you go to G, or in case of the Fourth Symphony, you start in B flat and you go to F, and you come back to B flat in every single one of the movements. That's sort of the general, and the goal is to find interesting ways to and from, if you will. And in the course of writing a melody or writing something, you will encounter something interesting that is outside of the rules. And you kind of have to solve for this problem, or you have to make this transition, or you have to somehow bring the melody to a close or open it to a new thing. And each one of these times he'll get to the end of a phrase, and you can sense him writing himself into a box. And instead of solving it, like Mozart would just write 2 notes and all of a sudden the problem would be solved. Beethoven then has one of these things in which he shocks everybody and will either go into a completely foreign key or will change the dynamic in a way that almost feels unnatural, but it will make things actually kind of more difficult, I think, from a compositional standpoint. But then we'll come back and solve it from an even more difficult position than he started in to begin with. And then kind of wills it into existence, which is, it's fascinating to watch. He does this over and over and over again. The Third Symphony is like this. I mean, in the Third Symphony, you begin and get to a foreign key within the first 12 measures. Because if you think about the melody, it's kind of, there is a banality to it until you encounter then all of a sudden the thing becomes interesting.
Right, and you're kind of going, what the heck is happening?
But otherwise, it's just an E flat major arpeggio. That's all it is. And there's kind of silly almost, right? But then in order to get out of the box of, I've written a kind of not great melody, he sort of sabotages it. And then all of a sudden there's a solution for him. But it's so fascinating because Mozart would have done it, he would have figured out an elegant solution to this that was kind of not bordering on what a lot of people thought was crude at the time, which now we sort of value in him. The Fourth Symphony, though, is Beethoven actually exhibiting the genius that he probably crafted for himself. There's not necessarily these problems. It feels like this symphony particularly feels like it just appeared to him. Whereas you can see where he had to work so hard for 3. He had to work so hard for 5 and 7 and 9. There's so much work. 4 has a virtuosity to it, a Mozart-like virtuosity, an ease to it that you can almost feel the burden lifted off of him. So you get Beethoven, but with ease, which is kind of nice because often it's a struggle to get to the end of these pieces. I mean, it's an empathetic struggle rather, and you sort of feel emotionally spent. This one is just really light. It sort of leaves everyone feeling good. It's in a great key, interesting key actually, and he just sort of is at his best. I think this is Beethoven at his truly sort of pinnacle of himself, where he doesn't self-sabotage. And just kind of writes from beginning to end. So it's a neat diversion from some of the sort of the rest of Beethoven. If you will.
One of the things that I've found interesting is initially as a concert goer, I'd read program notes and they'd say things like, Beethoven began sketches for this piece in 1803, and he finally brought it to fruition in 1809 or something like that. I'm going, geez, it took this guy 6 years to write a symphony. But one of the reasons for that turns out to be that he was working on a number of things at the same time, right? And so this piece, I gather, was written essentially concurrently with the Fifth Symphony, right? Or at least that he'd begun the Fifth Symphony, was working with it, and he more or less stopped his work on that piece in order to devote himself to this piece, and then returned to the Fifth. And so with these multiple pieces going, he's probably able to, whether he's feeling the need to be working with a piece of great struggle or with a piece of great ease and effortless abandon, he's probably able to devote himself day by day to one piece or the other.
Yeah. I mean, as a person who balances multiple projects, as we all do, there's that one that you're working on that's just hard and it's going to take a long time, which is his Fifth Symphony. I mean, it's a struggle. I could imagine how much of a struggle that piece was to write. And just needing to put it down and going and doing something that was easy for the sake of doing it. And that turns out to be a Fourth Symphony when the C minor one was probably going to be his intention was for that to be his next symphony, but he just sort of takes this diversionary it's almost like a mental break for him to just sort of write this thing, and then he could come back and finish the harder project, which probably was, I guess, maybe more meaningful to him, or maybe, I don't know, that's a presumption. I shouldn't presume that. It's that one took more effort, I think. And so, yeah, it's just it's an interesting sort of following his artistic compositional journey to go from 3, in which he was realizing that he was going deaf and writing this massive piece, skipping then to what would turn out to be 5, but then sort of having this 4th just sort of sit neatly in there as maybe this is one of these days where he was feeling really good and just sort of churn the thing out in a moment of inspiration. I mean, it took longer than that, but comparatively.
Right. For Beethoven to write a symphony in months.
Yeah.
That was, right, that was a relative breeze.
Right.
For him. And so for those of us who are familiar with the odd-numbered symphonies, who are familiar with the Titanic Third Symphony and are familiar with the incredible drama of the Fifth Symphony, the Fourth Symphony, by contrast, is going to give us something that is a little bit lighter and more playful and perhaps, would you say, more, I don't know. How do you sort of characterize it? It's certainly still got plenty of drama, and it's certainly still got plenty of excitement.
Yeah, it's childlike drama, though, in the sense that it's all in fun. Like, everything is intended to be sort of not serious. There is still the Beethoven moments that you get where you sort of get just all of a sudden really loud, raucous music. But it's more... It's kind of self-aware in a way. There's not even really that much minor key. So, Beethoven specializes in minor. It's a more interesting composition, especially at the time. You can do more interesting things in a minor key. So C minor, which is the Fifth Symphony. But rarely does he even ever go into a minor key in this one. So the whole thing just sort of bops. It just has a lot of punch to it. And you could imagine Mozart really liking this piece, or Haydn really, really liking this piece, because it just has a lightness to it that... the way that I truly imagine it is that Beethoven, he was an incredible improviser. Then he just sort of sat down at the piano one day and was just like, played it, and then had to go back and sort of write the thing down. But it just has one of these things that is a really optimistic, feel-good thing to it. With all the wonderful things that Beethoven also brings. Sort of the lightness of... Yeah,
you used the word kind of quickly there and in passing, a bop. And it does strike me as the perfect descriptor for this symphony, isn't it? It's Beethoven, but it's a bop.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to be frustrated with anybody. He's not frustrated with himself, not his audience or his publisher. He just sort of writes this thing for fun. It's why it's one of my favorites of his.
And it sounds like great date music.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Right. For February 17th, you can take out your date after Valentine's Day and come see this concert. It's going to be terrific. It's going to be a lot of fun. It is just going to be a fun concert. February 17th in Twitchell Auditorium, 7 p.m. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing you. And folks, I'm looking forward to seeing you there as well.
See you there.
Thanks for joining me today, Tom.
Thank you.